Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this panel discussion on the public perceptions of science with ISC patrons, entitled Unlocking Science, Should Scientists Do Better on Public Engagement? We're expecting a stimulating discussion on an issue which the ISC Secretariat recognizes has been exercising many of its members. My name is Nick Ishmael-Perkins, a senior consultant with the ISC, and leading on the Public Value of Science program. And I'm pleased to say we have all our august patrons joining us today. Mary Robinson, President of Ireland for 7 years. Her career spans a list of posts and achievements at the highest levels of statecraft. She's chair of the Elders, a member of the Club of Madrid, and a recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama. Her work is marked by a commitment to equity and sustainability, and her book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future, was published in September 2018. Welcome, Madam President.
Thank you very much.
Sarah Gelding is the founding director of the Biblioteca Alexandria, inaugurated in 2002, and currently serves as Emeritus Librarian and member of the Board of Trustees of the Library of Alexandria. He also serves on a number of advisory committees for academic, research, scientific, and institutional institutions. He has a deeply impressive array of international awards and honors. He is one of the most impressive academics I have met, both for his productivity and his humanity. And his impact on the global public science policy interface is a model for us all. He is also capable of delivering masterclasses in public speaking. Welcome, Ismail.
Thank you. Thank you.
Vint Cerf is one of the architects of the modern internet. He co-designed the TCP/IP protocol, which defines how computers communicate in a network system. Since 2005, he has served at Google, where he is now responsible for public sector business development. Feted by scientific academies and unions around the world, from NASA to the Swedish Royal Academy of Engineering, he has a formidable 29 honorary degrees. Welcome, Vint. Last but not least, we are joined by a figure familiar to many of you, Dea Reddy. He holds the South Africa Research Chair in Computational Mechanics at the University of Cape Town and is the outgoing president of the ISC. Welcome, Dea. Now, the events of the last couple of years around both the pandemic and the climate emergency have made clear the consequence of contested perceptions of science. We've seen positions that we hope to be fringe, providing leadership for entire nations. Scientists have become embattled figures in some spaces, and I don't know a single person who has not had at least one awkward conversation about the nature of scientific evidence as it relates to vaccines or climate. But all the global polls suggest that trust in science remains high. Is it high enough? And is the scientific community doing enough to shore up this trust? What are the implications for the ISC membership? These concerns are going to be addressed, and to understand this, we have to look at the extent of the problem we are facing and challenge ourselves about how we understand and measure public perceptions of science. We have a set of questions to discuss with our panelists today that allows us to tease out and interrogate some of these issues. Of course, we hope to hear from you, our audience, and I'll be taking questions from the floor throughout the discussion, so feel free to post the questions as they arise in the chat. And Mary, I'm going to start with you by asking a fairly blunt question. Are we facing a crisis in trust in science?
I think it's an interesting question. I'm not a scientist. I am somebody who came to the climate issue through a lens of human rights, which is why I talk about climate justice all the time. But I think there are lessons that we can learn from COVID. During this pandemic, it was collective human behavior that protected populations before the vaccine was rolled out. Secondly, I think that health scientists were listened to very seriously by any governments who wanted to deal with the problem. And the evidence is there that those who didn't listen to the health advice had far more deaths, far more people ill, a much worse economy. And that means that the argument of listening to science is reinforced. This is how I see it from a climate perspective. And so I do think that the survey is right, that trust in science remains high, but of course we have all the misinformation and the denial of vaccine and all that. And that's a problem. That's more a problem, I think, aggravated by social media, by the algorithms and by the way platforms, particularly Facebook, know that they will make more money by going to the dark side. So they allow people to go more and more to the dark side to make more money.
Thank you. That's, I think, Vint, we have to come to you because is it true? Do you feel like social media and the internet is aggravating the issue of trust in science?
Well, to first order, I think I don't entirely agree. Let me explain why. I do agree that there are feedback loops in the social media that lead people down dark paths. But I have to tell you that looking at people who twist statistics and misrepresent things, who are in fact would be credible in the scientific community, except for the fact that they are deliberately misrepresenting things, is a big problem. I have seen lengthy arguments that are backed up by what look like legitimate statistics that say that the vaccines are harmful, that they kill people, and so on and so forth. And that feeds a certain degree of confusion, at least, if not distrust, in the scientific community. So I'm very concerned that that people are using or abusing scientific terms and terminology and techniques in order to mislead people for whatever purposes that might be driving them. And that does worry me a great deal. The term alternative fact is a scary concept and one which we are going to have to do battle with, I think, in this coming decade.
Isabel, I see you smiling broadly. Does this mean that you are in agreement with Vint, or do you believe that indeed it is the use of the technology as opposed to technology that's driving a crisis?
No, partially I agree with Vint and partially I disagree, because I disagree on the point that there are ideological positions that have been taken by individuals and groups, and that regardless of the science that is in some cases overwhelming, we find the repetition of these alternative facts mostly for ideological purposes. Some of them, I mean, we were just today were listening to the governor of Texas and the governor of Florida trying to ban mandates of vaccination. So it's really taking an active position, not just rejecting the information that is present. And it is sad to point out, as I think you have pointed out, and as Vint does, that in general, the public still respects the scientists. But then there is this mixture that has come in, the alternative facts and the social media. Whether it is in GMOs, for example, genetically modified organisms for agriculture and food, which has been fought by particular groups in Europe for almost 20 years, or it is the anti-vaxxers in America, we now see ideological positions that are being espoused by political movements that have no merit in terms of an actual debate, where they are not really trying to debate with the scientists, but in fact are trying to obstruct the message of the scientists. And that's a big challenge for the scientific community, which I think needs to do a much better job in how it communicates. And this is where institutions like the ISC can play a big role in being the voice of science, dealing with a range of issues from governance to ethics to risks that need to be discussed.
I mean, I do want to, I understand the point that you're making completely, but I want to pick up on something that Mary said, which is that, you know, the evidence is there empirically. We can see that the governments that responded to the science are the ones that performed best. This suggests to me a certain optimism that the evidence will still win out, that these governments will say, actually, you know what? When we look around, actually, it's probably worth listening to them. Do we feel and Mary, I'm guessing you feel quite confident that that's going to happen. I see you're nodding. I want to ask Vint and Ismail, do you feel confident that that's going to happen?
Oh, I do not feel very confident about this. And the reason is that there is a backfire problem associated with the scientific process. Let me explain. I go to Ismail and I say, Ismail, I have a problem and I need some help. And Ismail says, well, what's the problem? And I tell him what it is, and he says, you should do X based on his knowledge. And so I thank him and I go off. 10 years later, I come back to Ismail and I say, listen, I still have this problem, but you've had 10 years to study this further. What is your advice? And he says, well, now that I've looked at this for 10 years, you should do Y, which is different than X. And now I could have one of two reactions. One of them is, thank you very much for suggesting this new response based on your research. But the other reaction could be, so you lied to me 10 years ago when you told me to do X, so I don't believe Y either. And to be quite blunt, I believe there are people who take advantage of that particular misunderstanding of science. Science is not absolute truth. It is the best approximation we have at the moment. And there are people who will twist that around and say you should distrust science. So I am not as optimistic as perhaps others.
Mary, do you have any thoughts or responses to that?
I have a thought in relation to climate, that it actually has meant that climate scientists don't necessarily communicate as well as we would wish they would. They've got better, but for too long, because I agree with Vint, it's not an absolute truth. But scientists were too careful about this in the beginning and allowed themselves to be exploited, if I could put it that way. I'm sorry to say that. Literally allowed themselves to be exploited in the climate context. Now, the IPCC has learned somehow and communicates better and is able to, say things that are meaningful in the political space. And that is important for scientists to understand how to communicate science well, rather than do it in the perfect science mode, which Vint was talking about.
Okay, and I think this is a very important point, because what we're getting to here are, I think, two issues. One is the lesson that it appears climate scientists have been, which is the tension, as it were, between the practice of science, which I was speaking to a scientist for a podcast that we're recording at the IIC, and he said, the practice of science is about reducing the uncertainty. It's a process of incrementally reducing uncertainty, whereas the practice of communicating science is about stating absolutes that people can make some decisions around. And that there's a tension there, which is very, very difficult to resolve, both for scientists and also for those who might be engaged in the communication of science. And I can see how climate science has really had to kind of grapple with that in quite a big way. And I think it's very helpful, Mary, for you to start to elaborate some of the lessons that climate science might offer the scientific community generally, reflecting on something like, for instance, COVID. I want to also come back to this point very quickly of, we have what we might think of as fringe movements. We talked about the local government in Texas. And for me, a challenge that I see is, how can we determine at what level a fringe movement or alternative facts become harmful? I mean, maybe it's okay, you're never going to convince everybody, and maybe that's okay, but can we take a position like that, or do we have the tools to do that? Should we even be trying to develop those tools? I see Vint, you're saying that actually this is not, the governor in Texas is not fringe, and I think this is a very important point. Do you want to reflect it? Again, Ismail is laughing. I'm going to come to Ismail first, and then, sorry.
Yeah.
Go on, Vint, go on.
Well, I just want to reiterate that these people are in charge right now. They have authority and power, and they can force people to either do things or not do things. I worry about that, because it means that the power structure has been infected by fringe idiocy.
Yeah. Ismail. Yes, go on, Ismail.
Well, I agree that these are not fringe people. They're governors of some of the biggest states in the nation and very prominent people in the Republican Party. But let's go back to climate change. Climate change, we are on the 6th IPCC report. The IPCC report, this is like every 5 years. We've now done it for 30 years. And practically every time the scientists say, what we said at the time was true, we were correct. We were too optimistic. Things look worse than what we reported on. And this has been going on every 5 years. And with a huge participation, hundreds of people participate in preparing these reports. Thousands of papers are reviewed and so on to give you the consensus on the science. So it is sad that as we speak today, the present path that we are on is for increased emissions, despite all declarations in Paris and so on 5 years ago. In addition to that, even if every promise made by every government was implemented today, there would be a slight decline from that, but still growing in emissions. So we are very far from the kind of radical transformation that we hope to get in order to try to stay within 1 or 2 degrees. And if that is the case, in an area where the vast majority of the public around the world believes climate change is real, it is much harder to do it elsewhere. And I think Vint is absolutely right when he points out that science evolves, knowledge of in science evolves. The best we can say is this is the best we can say right now, given the amount of information and data that we have. But as we learn more, we may change our point of view. And there are new things that will come out. I mean, before this last year, there was no such thing as mRNA vaccines. This is a new development, and I did this with somebody, and I said, well, this is all the first time. Things are changing wonderfully on the science side, but not so well on the political side.
I think this is a very astute observation, and I'm going to turn to you, Daya, to get your reflection on the state of the crisis and the conversation so far. I just want to acknowledge a comment from the floor that says actually things become more complicated because of disagreement among scientists. I mean, this is an inevitable part of the process of scientific consensus building. But it is true, again, proving how we have a tension here between the process of scientific knowledge making and building and the communication of science. Daya, your reflection so far. I think you're on mute, Daya.
So I was. Thanks very much, Nick. Yes, I'd like to comment in 2 broad areas. Firstly, that of trust and that of communication. And I might even refer to the last comment from the floor that you just read out. Let me start with communication. I think that we've heard along the way evidence or examples of, first of all, why science communication engagement with the broader public is important, but secondly, the fact that it is extremely important that we, and let me refer first of all to the science community, but also broadly, that we rethink the way in which we go about it. It is really something that lies at the nexus between science education, public outreach, sociology, behavioral sciences. What is it that we want to communicate? Well, of course, there are the details. One would like to explain how vaccines work and how the climate models work and so on. But additionally, and perhaps even more importantly, we have to convey more broadly how science works. What is science about? What do we mean by consensus? And why is it that when Ismail comes back to Vint 10 years later and says, well, actually this is how it is, because my model has improved, I've validated it, we have much better data and so on, and this is the consensus. How does all of that work? What is the role of uncertainty? There's been a comment here about the fact that with regard to the COVID crisis, we've had plenty of evidence of scientists disagreeing in public. Now, scientists do disagree. This is part of the whole business of working towards a consensus. Let me stop there with regard to communication, because I do want to say just a few words about trust and come back to the point made in the latest Pew Research report and in other reports that, broadly speaking, there is evidence that trust in science is high. I think that it's really important to analyze that and to disaggregate it. So I'd like to refer to a report by the Wellcome Trust, 2018, is a few years ago, which comes to the same conclusion. But if one looks at how this plays out in the global south, the global north, Western Europe, the developing world, and so on, the levels are rather different. They're very high in Western Europe. In parts of the developing world, not so. With regard to vaccine safety, so this is pre-COVID, it's kind of the other way around. So I think that in order to understand where we have to channel our efforts in building trust in science, we have to understand what the response is and what the nature is of trust or mistrust in science within different communities, not to mention policy makers as well. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Dea. I think this is a very important point that you make about the value of disaggregating audiences. I would agree that it's perhaps not the most helpful thing for us to be talking about global audiences as if that was a monolithic thing, because actually trust and distrust is expressed variously and driven by different factors in different contexts. There are a few questions that have come in, and some of them relate to the response, which we're going to get to in a minute. But there is one question which I am going to ask Vint, because it speaks very specifically, I think, to an issue that he's already spoken about quite passionately. Do we pay too much attention to fringe ideas? Do we, in fact, risk amplifying the marginal or dangerous ideas?
Very possibly so, because in the very act of refuting a fringe idea, you may give credibility to it because you have just spent time and energy to refute it. And people may ask, what is your motivation for this refutation? So I do wonder whether we are spending more time refuting fringe ideas than we are helping people understand what the real facts are. So I invite my colleagues to try to opine on that.
I'm going to come to Mary in a second to reflect. Oh, sorry. I see, Ismail, you're indicating that you were quite keen to respond to that. If you could do that very quickly, and then I want us to move on a little bit to talk about drivers. Yes. Mm-hmm. Go on, Ismail.
Okay, I wanted to just follow up on what Vint said. They tell politicians who are campaigning in the United States, stay on message, and they have developed it into a fine art to slough off questions that don't somehow enable them to message across. Unfortunately, we don't do that. We, the scientists, every time somebody asks us a question, we get into a discussion and an argument about it. So this idea of staying on message, people complain about the CDC and others that their messaging is not very good and so on, but that's partly because knowledge is advancing, new evidence comes in, and scientists change their mind. But scientists have to learn how to stay on message with the fundamental messages and stick with them in order to strengthen the political movement towards adopting the kinds of things that we think are absolutely essential, and then try to confine the disagreements push them at the margin and not let them disturb our fundamental messages.
Okay, thank you for that framing. And Mary, now I want to ask about the drivers of the current situation. You have suggested that technology, of course, is a big part of that. And we've also heard Ismail is implying that actually there is space really for us to improve the way that scientists engage with some of the borrowing from some political communication models, as it were. Do you see other drivers of the current situation on, which might be exacerbating our inability really to respond to these issues of distrust?
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I want to, in a way, build a little bit on something that Ismail was saying earlier about how serious the situation is in the alternative facts that Vint mentioned. I am very worried as chair of the elders about democracy in the United States. Very, very worried. I see a real dysfunction in the system that doesn't seem to be correcting itself. There isn't a dialogue now. The fact that, January the 6th and all the rest of it, and all the, Republicans covering for Trump, and it's almost unbelievable. And yet it's deeply, deeply worrying. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another thing I think I wanted to say was, when I message about climate, I ask people almost always when I speak now, I'll probably do it this evening when I'm speaking here at the TED Countdown for Climate, where I'm based in Edinburgh. We need to do three things, everybody. First of all, to take the climate crisis seriously, personally in your own life. And to do that, you need to, make a commitment to be doing something you weren't doing yesterday, like recycling a bit more carefully, changing your diet a bit more, whatever it is. But also, and this is Catherine Hayhoe's big message in her new book, Saving Us, we have to talk about it to everyone at all times. It has to become colloquial in the community. It's amazing how little we talk about climate in real life, even though people now know it's affecting us. The second step is to get angry with those who aren't taking steps. And that's obviously governments, cities, investment, business, corporations, et cetera, the fossil fuel industry in particular. And thirdly, and we don't do this enough, we have to imagine this future that we're going to be hurrying towards. And I was at a climate lab storytelling event this morning, because I'm very keen on storytelling. That was what my book on climate justice was about. And there was a lot of reference to imagining this world. After all, we've got to get there, more or less, by 2030. That's 9 years away. And I don't think scientists are talking enough about imagining this world.
I think this is a really interesting observation. And so, I'm also reflecting on the comments you made at the beginning of your intervention, Mary, and I'm wondering, is there a suggestion that we need a particular mode of engagement in a strong democracy, which is quite different from how we might engage with a weak, fragile, or faltering democracy?
It's hard to say. I mean, at the moment, my preoccupation is what happens before COP, at COP, and alongside COP. Before COP at the G20 coming up very soon. Many of the, a number of the G countries, big ones, China, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, have not made commitments. Others, Australia, Indonesia, etc., have made commitments, but not nearly ambitious enough. On the finance side, Italy, as chair of the COP, ought to be paying more. So should France, to make sure we have that 100 billion before we go into COP. And then at COP, we have to actually do an assessment, which I think is doable, to see whether we are aligned going forward with 1.5. As Ismail rightly said, we're not at all aligned now. The synthesis report said we would increase by 16% between now and 2030 under the present trajectory. So we need to take stock. And then the governments have to make themselves accountable for closing that gap in the every year post Glasgow, post this year. And then thirdly, alongside that, all the things in sectors, in the methane agreement that is important, and all those other things have to take place.
Yes, no, and I can see actually that what you're talking about really is a multidimensional term of engagement. And clearly what you need are champions at all levels of society with various types of expertise. I mean, it is properly what we might call a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary operation.
Absolutely.
Ismail, I am going to turn to you now to ask, do you feel that that we've covered the drivers of the current problem enough? Are there any drivers that we haven't made mention of so far?
Yes, I think that we have at least three major drivers that we have not looked at enough, and which I believe are going to be very central to this kind of debate and the relationship between the science community and the public at large and politicians and decision makers. The first of these is indeed what I would refer to as ethics. I served on a special panel by the US National Academies of Science to try to answer the question, when should the techniques of the new biology be used on humans and embryo research? And people sense the other end of the life pattern when, as I say, in my father's time, there was nothing as straightforward as whether somebody is alive or dead. Today, it's a question about who pulls the plug and who has the authority to pull the plug, and when do you put somebody on respirators, when do you stop doing it? The new technology gives us new kinds of questions where the ethics haven't been sufficiently developed. And this is true not just of the questions of medicine, which are going to increase in the years ahead, but also in the questions that are intergenerational responsibilities, or as Mary has said, climate justice. People who did the least to create the problem of climate change are the ones who are going to suffer most, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where famines and so on will occur. So ethics to me is a very important area, and we must find new ways of discussing these issues in order to develop evidence-based regulations and science-based policy. Second point is governance. Governance generally of how the scientific enterprise is carried out, and the balance between the private sector and the public sector, and the degree of transparency. And luckily, a lot of the scientific community is behind the open science platform, the open science movement, to keep everything available to everybody. And the last point really is this notion that we have, you have data, a lot of data, big data, but data, when it's organized, becomes information, and when it's explained, it becomes knowledge. But societies need more than knowledge. They need wisdom. They need the ability to pull people together, to include, and so on, which is not at present within our paradigm. And I think the idea that science really advances by confronting ideas, by challenging ideas, and testing them. And we have either evidence supports it or it doesn't. And this is, I think, a technique of advancing, which, however, has the seeds of also planting doubt, because you are confronting all the time new ideas, sometimes fringe ideas, against conventional wisdom. But I think, as Vince said earlier, that not every fringe idea is worth keeping, and conventional wisdom evolves over time as well. So these are the three drivers that I see that are going to affect this kind of dialogue.
What's interesting for me about this is that, within the Public Value of Science program at ISC, we have a panel of experts, and there is a freedom of expression activist on that panel, Courtney Raja. And she says, what's really important is for scientists to be engaging with gatekeepers. So, really thinking about things like internet governance and freedom of expression around journalists, because those are the kinds of people that are mediating the data and the knowledge making chain, as it were, that value chain that you're referring to, Ismail. And what you have pointed out is actually, indeed, this is an important sector for us to be thinking about. Vint, I couldn't help but note the comment that you made about the need for quite actionable recommendations from science and scientists. And of course, this, and I know now we're leaning a bit towards how to respond, but I'm mindful of the time, and I think we probably need some, to start giving that some thought. I'm going to ask you just to elaborate a little bit on that, particularly in light of a question from Jeffrey Bolton, where he says, actually, by advocating a specific policy, do scientists risk losing that part of their credibility that comes from their perceived independence? And indeed, such advocacy may, in the heat of public policy debate, even lead to corruption of evidence and minimization of uncertainty. So do you see a tension here between being able to provide actionable solutions, or to contribute to actionable solutions, and again, the very process of scientific inquiry?
I don't think that these need to be in tension with each other. I think that what is important is a scientist who chooses to advocate a particular course of action needs to explain what it is that leads the scientist to that conclusion. So what is the scientific evidence that drives a particular course of action that is advocated? The big issue here is to make sure that the advocacy can't be misrepresented as personal interest or some other corrupt influence. And again, that goes back to being able to show what the scientific evidence is that leads one to a particular policy or another. The same argument could be made in the COVID case about, do you wear a mask or you don't not wear a mask? What is the evidence that tells you that masking is a useful thing to do? Similarly for vaccinations and the like.
Mm-hmm. Dea, I'm going to ask you again for your thoughts on some of these questions, but I want to just pick up on what Vint has said there, because I think I sometimes wonder whether or not those scientists operating in the public sector, so outside of the private sector where you have actually quite sophisticated commercial machinery, have a political or conceptual blind spot about the way that scientific consensus might be engaged or taken up. The idea is that actually you say what you feel, the evidence is there, and people will act on it. It doesn't account for the fact that sometimes if you say something that has enough consequence or is disruptive enough, that there will be people who will be actively lobbying against this. And how do we respond to that particular challenge? Dea, I'm afraid I'm going to ask you to reflect on that. Sorry, you're muted again, Dea.
Yeah, sorry about that. No, look, indeed, what you're describing is a reality, and you're referring to the scientific community, in this case, the scientific community in the let's say in the public sector as a homogeneous entity, which it most certainly is not. And once again, if one were to disaggregate, then I think that one would find evidence of what you're describing. But it does, it does bring me back to the matter of communication by scientists in relation to the public in particular, but also to policymakers. I'd alluded earlier to the fact that we desperately and urgently need to rethink the way in which we communicate. So I think that early on in the session, Nick, you had referred to what the role of the ISC might be. What is the position of the ISC in relation to these kinds of challenges? With regard to this particular issue of communication, we and by that I mean the scientific community has a responsibility to communicate its science. And of course, we do so through journals and the like, but to communicate its science more broadly in an accessible way and in a comprehensible way, which is not to say that each and every single individual scientist has the responsibility to go and do their best in communicating to the general public. We, as the ISC and our member bodies, have a responsibility to find ways of ensuring that is pursued in the appropriate way. Which brings me to my second point. We, again, the scientific community, I think have gone badly wrong in the recent past, and maybe at present as well, in the manner, with regard to the manner in which we communicate, which has brought allegations of elitism. If one goes back to GMOs, allegations of elitism on the part of the scientific community, instances of scientists being completely disrespectful towards the public. So, I'm not referring here to individuals who are rampant anti-vaxxers. If one takes vaccines, there are members of the public who are hesitant for one reason or another. There are moral intuitions, there are cultural contexts which come into play. How do we go about discussing science in those particular contexts? I think that we have to reflect on where we have gone wrong in this regard in the past and what we have to do in order to ensure that we engage effectively and in a respectful way with the broader public.
Thank you for that very, I think, timely and important intervention, Dea. And Mary, I'm going to ask, do you think it's true? Has the scientific community been guilty of that moral outrage of leaving one behind?
Well, let me explain what I was thinking about when I was approached to become a patron of the ISC. I didn't know about the ISC. I had to look it up, and and I saw, to my pleasure, to my interest, that it was an amalgamation the year before of two different bodies, one on the science in a more pure sense, now I'd probably get given out to for using that word, and the other, the social sciences. And I thought that was a great strength of the ISC, that they would somehow try to bring them together. And let me, if I may, just very, very briefly, quickly rather, tell you a story about the Paris Climate Agreement, which isn't fully understood. Mm-hmm. I was the special envoy of the Secretary General before Paris. I was witnessing what happened. I saw the informal ministerial meetings were very boring, except for one voice. Tony de Bruym, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, kept saying to his fellow ministers, do you want my whole island to go under? Do you want us to no longer be a sovereign people? Do you want us just to buy land and migrate to another country and have no sovereignty, etc., etc.? Then the marching in the street in Paris of the poorest countries, the Climate Vulnerable Forum of 48 countries, the indigenous peoples, the young people, 1.5 to stay alive, to get the 1.5 into the goal. And then the High Ambition Coalition formed in Paris. And that was led by Tony de Bruym, joined by the European Union, the United States, and others, with the real purpose of getting 1.5 degrees into the text. And when we got that new goal of staying well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5 degree, the scientists had to be asked, could you please look at this? Because they seem to have given up on 1.5. I don't know. Maybe one of my colleagues can explain. But anyway, the Paris Agreement asked the IPCC, and that was the source of the special report in October 2018 on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And that was so important, because that was where we learned we had to reduce by 45% by 2030. And it's the whole, the whole dialogue now of COP is that dialogue. But the scientists would not have led that. So a bit of humility by the scientists would be called for, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I think this is a fascinating story. I'm going to ask actually Ismail if he has any reflections on this as what do you take away from that scenario about how we communicate effectively for policy impact?
I think you are absolutely right that most of these things are not done by just scientific reports. I see something spotlight.
We can hear you. We can see you.
You can see him. Okay. I think, for example, Greta Thunberg had more impact than half the scientists working in IPCC because she brought forth with an enormous amount of sincerity and passion the feeling of a younger generation who is saying to us, what are you leaving us? We are going to have to live with the results of this. We, the young people, she was a teenager at the time, and she really had a very powerful impact. So I think that the amount of impact is not just the amount of data and studies that we put forward, but over the medium term, not even the long haul, over the medium term, cumulative work done in science does create a consensus, and that consensus can be later on translated into a political consensus as well. The question, though, is that on many of the issues we are facing, we are in a race with time, and whether we can do it quickly when we have lobbyists and huge financial interests playing important roles, I think is a very big challenge. And I think that some of my colleagues who say, well, behavioral change, when people will do that, they will stop eating beef and they will ride bicycles and give up on their cars and etc. But I'm not so sure that they will do that. People see people dying and still refuse to take vaccines. So I'm not sure that 30 years from now is enough of a challenge to make people transform their daily lives. But every little bit helps. But more importantly, I think, is the stark way of putting forward intergenerational equities, or as the case happened with the islands, the small, the SIDS as we call them, these islands are going to disappear with sea level rise. And what happens there? These are very dramatic moments that I think can help galvanize movement on scientific material that is being established in advance.
Okay, and so Vin, in the 5 minutes that we have left, I think we have a very sobering reminder from Ismail that, you know, the crises that we're facing are really very time sensitive. And we've also heard that actually for all of the relative success, actually, of climate science, we are still not where we need to be. How do we, so it suggests to me that we really have got to be making some kind of change. Something needs to be expedited. What would your message to the ISC membership be? What should they be doing?
I would suggest two things. The first one is to provide messages that can reach individuals that tell them what they can do individually that will in fact make a difference, because too many people say, well, it's just me and I have one car and I'm just one out of billions. And so, you know, what difference does it make? We have to help people understand what difference individual actions can make. And second, we have to provide incentives for parties in the commercial sector and other sectors that are generating huge amounts of greenhouse gases. Those incentives need to drive them towards decisions that reduce that output.
A very useful summary. I think what strikes me actually with the first suggestion is that, of course, messaging is important, but also we need to be thinking about those as audiences in the first place. You know, I think very often we think of policy spheres and we think of 15 people, usually men, sitting around a table, but we don't think actually, in fact, we have to think more comprehensively. It's a bit like Mary was saying, you know, you are describing what is a vast interdisciplinary exercise. And for science, there is often this conceptual blind spot around disaggregating audiences and thinking, if, as you're saying, Vin, let's think about what individuals can do and recognize that there are different types of individuals in different contexts and so on. And so we need to be finding ways to access these groups and to have some kind of dialogue with them. I'm going to turn now to Ismail and ask you, Ismail, very quickly, one or two things that you think the ISC membership should be doing in view of where we're at and the challenges ahead of us, specifically on communicating.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I believe there are two things that we should be doing as the ISC. One of the things that we do have is an enormous membership that is all over the world. And I think we can and should be able to develop more of what I will refer to as infographics that are nice, easy to read, summary presentations of information, not necessarily in complex material, and ask our membership to use that to reach out further so that we have a constant outflow that deals with the social media by our membership, supported from the center with the best that we can do in terms of simplifying and presenting the latest and best science.
Okay, thank you. Was there anything else? Is that it that you wanted to? Yeah. Okay, and Mary, I'm now going to turn to you and ask you again, actually, what do you think the ISC membership can be doing in the current context?
I would like the ISC to communicate in very climate justice terms, the injustices of climate change and the urgency of, the fact that we're not on track for a safe world. To talk to people in terms of motivating them, as we've said, to take their responsibility at all levels. And I've mentioned, make it personal in your own life, get angry about those who should be doing more, and imagine this world. We haven't talked about that. Imagine this world we need to be rushing towards. For goodness sake, we have to be rushing towards it in 9 years. It will be a much healthier world. There won't be the fumes of fossil fuel that kill 9 million people a year with indoor and outdoor pollution. There won't be, we'll be regenerating, regreening. There are innovations in agriculture that I'm very interested in, based on the kind of Moderna approach to vaccines that are, using molecular biology. Scientists need not to just talk about molecular biology. They need to talk about what this means for ordinary people, in their lives, and get them excited. If people are excited about the future, they'll work for it. If they're afraid it's going to cost them and be unaffordable, like clean energy being unaffordable and how do I insulate my house, we're not going to get there.
No, and I think this is a very inspiring note on which we can end, to think about what would science communication look like if it was driven by visionaries.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that we have run out of time. I know there were several comments and a number of questions that we did not get to, but as you will appreciate, this is a rich and particularly live stream of conversation. And I think we would really need quite a few more days to be able to build consensus. But I really need to first thank the patrons for the time that they have committed for the conversation here today, and indeed for their continued stewardship and support to science as a global public good. The ISC depends on their engagement and championship for science to be transformative and responsive to our contemporary global challenges. I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us and for engaging so actively. And of course, my gratitude to the team behind the scenes who've been keeping the General Assembly ticking along. Now, I'd like to take just a quick moment to let you know about an occasional paper which is discussing the latest science on science communication and some revealing global surveys, which we published on the 25th of October to coincide with the UN Global Media and Information Literacy Week. Our hub, Unlocking Science, the result of our partnership with BBC Storyworks, will be launched on bbc.com on the 9th of November. We'll also continue to discuss these issues at the Berlin Science Week with a panel on the 10th of November, which will be looking at prioritizing institutional responses. And over next year, we'll have a series of webinars addressing issues around these responses. And you can sign up to the ISC newsletter for further details on all this if you haven't already signed up. And now we will enjoy some live music from Christoph Spannenberg, and then we will move into the inaugural International Science Council Awards. Thank you, everyone.